to talk about a subject that's quite large for a 30-minute discussion, but we're going to face it head on in hopes to do it justice and perhaps give you all some food for thought. In the process of addressing the driving forces behind Brexit and the Trump ascendancy, hopefully we're going to answer another question, hopefully, which is the logical follow-on and what to do about it. So first off, I do want to clarify that we're not going to talk about the politics involved. In fact, I'm going to ask you both questions more about your roles as private citizens and investors with respect to investment in venture capital funds and in companies, high-growth companies mostly, and with regards to startups, both in the United States and in Europe. Also, if you can possibly address how it might impact your investing going forward, we'd love that. We'll hope to get to that. And finally, I promise not to pull any punches. So I'm going to be asking you rather demanding questions. I don't want pundits' answers. And therefore, the first question goes to Albert. Albert, USV invested in Twitter, didn't it? And do you mind giving me any perspective on what you think or what they think about how to create a platform for self-expression, but one that also stays on the right side of the pros and cons of free speech?
Yeah, I think we're at a time where what we can do with technology is ahead of both what we can do individually psychologically, how we interact with this type of information, and where we are with a social consensus as to what type of speech these platforms should allow. So I actually think the technology has sort of charged ahead. We have these global systems, Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, that connect everybody. And individually, we have this challenge that we go online, we get these very small prompts. It's not like sitting across from a person, it's just a piece of text and we go, that is so stupid, and like all caps, and so it very rapidly devolves. So individually, we deal poorly with those systems. And yes. I think collectively as society, we haven't kind of formed the right dialogue. What's the responsibility of these systems? What type of speech should or should they not be reinforcing or potentially policing? And so I think it's very hard to go and say to these companies, go figure it out, when we really haven't figured it out for ourselves.
Well, if I can build on that, what's really fascinating about the tools of Twitter and Facebook and the like is that they make people, all of us here individually, the content and the media simultaneously. And to your point, that's a whole new role. I'm not a trained journalist, yet I'm able to publish whatever I want online. And then all of a sudden I'm responsible at this whole new level. And it's an awakening I think we're all having, right?
But I do think that we need to have this discussion. And I do think we shouldn't let the platforms entirely off the hook. So I'm not suggesting that they shouldn't be doing things. It's just, I think, people who say, well, there's easy solution X, I have yet to see easy solution X that actually is a solution. And so I think it's a fairly complicated problem. And it has to do with this extraordinary amplification that digital technology represents, right? So things, if you have a small conversation on a small stage surrounded by your best friends, what you say will only travel so far. But on the internet, it could travel through the entire world. And so we're finding ourselves in sort of a new territory. And I think the first step is to acknowledge that there is a big problem. And I think there we've made some real progress in the last few months.
Correct. Acknowledging just that there's a problem is great. Do we have any guidelines on how to even start thinking about it?
I think I can toss an idea out for discussion. I think there's some offline analogies. If you look at all of the discussion that's occurred, at least in the US, around what is freedom of speech and what comes on the other side and what's hate speech, and then what are the sort of general rules of engagement, like not crying fire in a crowded theater, and all those things that have happened in the stable real world need to occur online and have the same evolution of self-regulation as well as tools to help make it happen.
Yeah, I think we have some ideas, right? So providing more context would be a good thing. So meaning linking back to, okay, this is a story, what do we know about the publication that it came from, linking back to source material. Much of this can be done by machines. They can sort of link back further. So providing more context is definitely something we can do. We can definitely say that strictly promoting things on the basis of signal within system is bad because it gives you these information cascades where somebody retweets something that gets retweeted, and then it sort of accelerates because of that. It gets surfaced for more people, it gets more retweeted. So we understand some of the problems that we can solve. But then when you get into the more subtle things, what one person sort of finds an offensive remark, another person sees as just a challenge that gets them to think. And so there, I think the answers are going to be much harder to find.
So again, I'm still not going to pull any punches. I'm not going to go down that any further, but I will talk about an article that we've been discussing amongst ourselves. And I'm going to ask the audience if you haven't read it. Malik published an opinion piece in the New Yorker, I think it was.
Yes.
On the 28th of November. It's worth reading. I've heard many people across many stages and in private discussions talking about this over the course of the conference. And basically he said many wonderful things, but one thing that jumped out at me was that the Brexit and Trump's ascendancy have focused attention on the sense that globalization has eroded any real prospects and hopes of our working classes. And in this case, he meant globalization is a proxy for technology-powered capitalism, which rewards fewer and fewer members of society. And I am the editorializing question asker, I know that. So what's the role of technology in all this? And Beezer, I'm going to ask you this first. And having said that, innovation is faster and faster. It's at record levels. We also have a falling median income and fewer jobs. All of this is falling because technology is advancing faster than our skills and our organizations are keeping up. So what is the role in technology in all this?
Well, at a simple yet high level, technology is an enabler, and it is a tool. So that sort of is the general context. I think the kind of point that Ohm was getting at in the greater context is, where's the role of empathy and integrity and the implementation of these tools? And just because you can build it and you can do it and it might be a great business, how does that then impact the greater society? And how do we as people come together to look at that? And do you just ask the executives of these various companies to think about it? Or do you ask the whole society that's engaging with it to think about it?
Is it within the company or is it the government's role?
Both.
What were you telling me backstage about something that Katarina Fake said on another stage?
Oh, Katarina on that stage earlier this morning made a great comment about thinking at ways to infuse technology with integrity, and there are companies like Kickstarter and Etsy that she's been personally part of that have done a really nice job of doing that. They're also part of the Union Square world. I don't know.
Yeah, I think something fundamental that's worth talking about is that in the analog world, in the physical world, we mostly dealt with normal distribution of outcomes. What do I mean by that? If you were a shoemaker and you were the most productive shoemaker, you would make maybe twice as many shoes as the average shoemaker. And so as a result, wealth distribution and income distribution among shoemakers wasn't sort of very wildly off. It looked like a bell curve, basically, with the vast bulk of the people being fairly close to each other. And as we've moved to the digital world, where we have zero marginal cost, what we've seen is that everything has transitioned to these, what we call power laws. So a power law looks more like the most viewed video on YouTube has been viewed, billions of times, and the least viewed video has literally been viewed 0 times. Not even the person who uploaded it watched it, right? And that's happening across many, many, many professions. And when you get these power laws, you get income and wealth following these power laws also. And I think we need to recognize that that's what's happening. And again, we need to then decide as society what we're going to do about it. But I think step one is recognizing that in many aspects, like think about teaching, right? When you had traditional schools, some teachers would in college teach larger classes, other smaller classes, but the difference wasn't very large. But as you move online, some teachers might have the definitive physics lecture that might have millions, tens of millions of students using it, and that will look very different from the person who is teaching just a couple of students. So I think this is happening across the board, and we need to deal with its implications.
Okay. Then let me throw a little bit more at you, which is just, there are many data-driven companies out there. Facebook, Google, Uber, etc. And here's a very specific, I'm hitting you guys with ethical questions because it's lovely to say, oh yes, we should think about it, we should do about it, but I would love to get to even just a beginning of a framework of how to think about it. It might be too much to ask. But these companies, Uber, Amazon, Google, Facebook, they can't ignore the fact that their algorithms have an impact on society in the shape of popular sentiment. So that in some cases takes the face of maybe changing an election. And that's not to be taken lightly, I'm not setting that aside. But they also have to acknowledge that they're slowly destroying jobs, right? I mean, you just can't say, oh, that's progress, sorry, that's the way it goes. Airbnb is destroying jobs in the hotel industry. Amazon is doing so in retail. Any self-driving technologies destroys trucking jobs. And I'll even make it a little personal for myself. I mean, I remember what it was like to live paycheck to paycheck and knowing that I wasn't going to get bailed out. Living in New York City, okay, first world problem, but there was no way I was going to get bailed out. What do we do about, and Karen said this the other day, Karen Harris on this stage said, the car doesn't start. You can't serve as the car doesn't start. Car doesn't start, you can't go to work. You can't go to work, you lose your job. You lose your job, you lose your house, right? And I don't think many people who are making these decisions remember, maybe ever had that fear. I remember having that fear. It makes me feel very vulnerable, but I try to remember it. And I take that into my daily job of I'm responsible for, 30 salaries. I'm not making life decisions and death decisions in my job, but how do we start creating in these companies the ability to think about this responsibility, or does it just all have to get regulated by the government?
Yeah, I mean, Beezer earlier mentioned companies like Etsy and Kickstarter. There is a movement of companies that are so-called benefit corporations that try to think about not just their shareholders' returns, but also some mission that the company is pursuing. And I've spent a fair bit of my time on helping get the benefit corporation legislation passed in Delaware, which is where most venture-backed companies are incorporated. I still think that fundamentally these new companies are creating fewer jobs because there's so much more leverage in what they're doing, right? So when you're building a platform, a technology platform, you need few people to build it, and then lots of economic activity can happen on that platform. So I don't think we can expect those companies to be dealing with the question of where will and how will people earn their livelihood. I mean, I think we can expect these companies to deal with questions like, what is my responsibility towards the people who operate on my platform? But I think the larger question, the earlier panel I was on, questions like universal basic income, I think is something we have to have as a discussion, because individual companies simply can't solve those things.
I think we can expand the definition, or people have already expanded, to your point, the definition of shareholder value and the responsibility to the shareholder. And if you're I don't know if the whole community at large that uses the product, you could count that as a shareholder. I think they mean it more specific. And if you're an employee, what is my responsibility to you? If you're a platform user, what's my responsibility to you? Not just is my role as an executive in these firms to make money. So I think that's a very vibrant discussion that's been going on for years. Now met with are there even greater societal questions that even go beyond that are now going to get pushed? And what's the role of education? And how does education need to flex so that as fewer people are needed to produce whatever it is they're producing, how does it still become, people are useful and feel good about what they're doing? And that's a whole community answer. It's not just any one executive.
And one other thing, I was talking about the power laws earlier. One other thing that's happening is that because of network effects, in many industries, we're now seeing a dramatic consolidation where there's only one large player or maybe a couple of very large players globally. And that's something that's problematic because competition historically has been very good for innovation. Competition has been good for customers. Competition lets you compare how different systems handle the same question. If you suddenly have only one or two players, you are going to see less of that. So the question is, how do we think about that? And the European Union is coming at this with more traditional antitrust regulation. I believe that there's a different approach that I think is more interesting, which is asking how we can shift more power back to the end user. And what I mean by that is, if you think about Twitter, which you started this discussion with, in the early days of Twitter, Twitter had an open API, and lots of different people wrote Twitter clients. And then at some point, Twitter decided to close down that ecosystem because Twitter was suddenly worried that it wasn't going to make enough money if all these different clients were around. Yeah. But if we could go back to that type of world, so if the regulation looks more like, hey, if you have an app, you also have to have an API so that other people can write apps, then we could have some type of competition again. And if you think about something like Facebook or Twitter, if you could have your own clients, then it would get a lot easier, for instance, to also use a third-party service to tell you whether a news article you've just clicked on, how reliable it is, what sources. And so now we could have sort of new third-party providers emerging that help address some of those problems. I am worried that if we have these large monocultures that are just one corporation, that bad things will not only happen, but they won't be discoverable. So you won't actually be able to tell what bad thing has happened. So one example is, bringing it back to the Trump election, is that the Trump campaign spent about $150 million on Facebook running ads. And it's very hard to tell, for instance, what effect those ads had on voter turnout. Facebook has the data, but it's hard to sort of analyze how much of an impact it really had. And so if we open this up a little bit, so I'm not talking about any kind of regulation that would break up a company like Facebook. I'm talking about regulation that would make it possible again for third parties to come up with independent estimates that are reliable of the kind of impact it has. Then I think we're going back to something where there's some sense of external supervision of what's happening.
Or even just sort of accountability was the word that came to mind.
Yes.
And the other image I had in my head when you were speaking was on eBay with the whole third user feedback mechanism. So there was a very large trusted community that grew because you could give feedback if someone was a good participant in the community, and that has sort of seemed to have gone away a bit.
Albert, do you think the regulation has to come from outside? Do you think it's absolutely not possible to to have a company build it from within and be accountable? You seem to be relying more on outside governance.
No, what I believe is that ultimately we always have an interplay between regulation and what companies do. Yeah. And so we're in this big transition period where a lot of our regulatory frameworks are from the industrial era. Like antitrust is from the industrial era. Yep. And a lot of regulators are still thinking about regulatory solutions as if the internet hadn't been invented. And so what I'm saying is we need to come up with the right regulation. So the analogy I always like to use is the car. When cars first came out, the early regulation was literally saying we're going to treat this like a horse-drawn buggy, and so we're going to regulate it the same way. It can't be faster than a horse-drawn buggy. Some of that was protectionism of the horse-drawn buggy industry. Some of it was just not understanding that cars were different. But ultimately, we only got benefit from cars, not because we had no regulation, but because we had the right regulation. We had rules of the road, and we had governments building roads. Yep. And so I think we need the right regulation for the digital age, and it's going to look different from industrial regulation.
I also think, I don't think people are arguing we want to outsource morality to some sort of algorithm, right? I don't think that's what's being asked for. So you can't take people out of the equation as far as just say, here's a tool and let it run. Like that needs to be with the assumption that these tools happen in a greater context, which is the physical world, and what does that interaction look like?
Fine, then I'll go to an even tougher question. What is your responsibility, each of you as investors, like to decide which companies to invest in, to decide not to invest?
I'd actually argue that's an easier question, if I may. Only because if you think about it from a micro perspective of, we have a fund, we're going to do a certain number of investments in our fund, and that's a finite pool. We don't need to do every single deal that's out there. There's 3,000 venture-backed companies done in the US and a slightly smaller number in Europe per year. We don't need to be in every one of those deals.
But can you do due diligence on evil? Do you actually look at companies without saying any names? Albert and I had an interesting conversation over lunch yesterday about companies that he would never back and companies that we would never represent. Interestingly, I don't know if we agreed on everything, but we agreed definitely on one for exactly the same reason. And so you guys, I now, knowing you, I now feel that you each have a responsibility, you feel a personal responsibility not to fund evil. However, evil or bad technologies or technologies shouldn't be built, as you have said to me, they're going to be built anyway. So do you have a responsibility to get in there? What is your responsibility? Just not to fund it, or to go ahead and fund it and make sure that as much as you can?
I'm not sure. Well, it depends on what you're saying about evil. You can take it in a couple different ways, so I'm just considering. There's certainly some things that we actually say, and it's in a lot of actually the GP, LP documents that govern each other, say that we're not going to invest in things like weapons, liquor. There's certain things that are literally explicitly said we're not going to invest in. That's pretty prevalent in the industry. And then the more subjective question is, do you think this company is producing a technology that may or may not be helpful to the world versus outright evil?
Or in the hands of its current management,
then that becomes
go terribly wrong.
Then what you're actually questioning then is the team. And do you want to back those people? And people make that decision every single day to do or not do it. And I think it's your responsibility as an investor to be true to what you have decided your fund will be about. And that is a discussion you have with every fund has to raise capital from somewhere. And so it's what you've told your investors you will and won't be doing with it. And they've made an agreement with you, and then you go out and do it. So it's actually all fairly transparent at some level. I don't know, do you have a different view?
Yeah, I think we have a set of principles that we believe in. So, for instance, we believe in things that empower, at the end of the day, the edge over the center. And so, we've been investing a lot recently in blockchain companies because we believe over the long run, the blockchain has the potential to help shift power away from the centralizing forces to the edge. But I also think it's often hard to anticipate what a specific company, what impact it will have. So I still would invest in Twitter. I still use Twitter. I think Twitter has had some incredibly positive impacts, and now we're dealing with some problems. Almost the history of technology and mankind is that we develop some new technology, it solves some problems, and it creates a new set of problems.
Yes.
And so I think we need to acknowledge a couple of things. We need to have some principles. We need to have more of a discussion of values. I think the Alm's piece about empathy, I think, was good, but I think there's also this question of values. What are some things we really believe in? And then I think we need to recognize that whatever we do technologically, while it will solve one problem, will create a new set of problems. And so, for example, things we have stayed away from are things that will further commoditize labor. We have conversely invested in a lot of things that will help people educate themselves, that will help people improve their health. But that doesn't mean that the sort of forces of technology that are, making capital increasingly a substitute for labor, those are playing themselves out, and that's why we need to, at the level, collective level, the political level, the social level, we need to have this discussion of values, and we need to, for instance, decide at some point whether full employment, whether that's a value we want to be pursuing, and I would argue that's a value from the industrial era and not one we should be pursuing today.
Agreed. Then going back to Brexit and Trump, I had actually wanted to tackle this and making sure, we don't really have time, but have you changed any of your investment theories with regards, because of the outcome of Brexit and the Trump election? Have you at USV and have you at Sapphire?
I don't think we've changed our investments or our investment strategy. I do feel like it's given us a reason to double down on the ideas of how can technology help individuals in their lives? Like, how can we make education accessible to a lot of people? How can we let people improve their healthcare easily and very cost effectively? We recently invested in a company called Nurix that gives you access to certain types of medication, including a doctor's visit, at effectively less of the cost than a traditional copay. And so, so even if, let's say, the Affordable Care Act now goes away, this company will make, not to all of care, but to certain types of care, access vastly more broadly accessible. And so, that's the type of investing we've already been doing, and that's the type of investing we'll continue to do, and we'll probably be doubling down on.
Good.
So my role at Sapphire is to invest in early stage venture funds, and each fund itself has sort of between a 10 and 12-year life cycle. And the point of this context is it's a very long-term horizon. So individual impacts like Brexit or a different government administration, every fund cycle will exist all during these, yes. Right? And so my job is to pick managers that I believe can look at the current context as well as understand that things will shift during the lifetime of their fund and make sound investments.
And to be able to manage
to manage through it. So my job is not to micromanage that, but to pick managers I have faith in that will be able to think through these. Because if you look at the arc of innovation in technology, it continues onward because of the driving forces of Moore's Law and things of that nature, regardless of who's in the White House and who's not. Like, this has been going on since the steam engine days, so that's going to continue. So I need to look for managers that can work within that context.
Fair. I want to thank you both. It's been such an enjoyable process preparing for this, talking to you all, and doing this. So thank you, Albert. Thank you, Beezer.
Thanks, Colette.